The other famous structure related to Justinian is San Vitale, which is located in Ravenna, Italy. San Vitale is named after Saint Vitalis, who was a saint that had been martyred. We don't really need to know a lot about his background, but again, that's the name of the church is named after Saint Vitalis or San Vitale. It is important to really understand the location of Ravenna, Italy, however, because this is where the Byzantines felt that their boundary was between the old Latin West, right, and all those groups, the Goths, the Vandals, whatever. They thought that this was sort of the last outpost. Ravenna was the last place that they had control over before the wilds, right, of these barbaric groups began. So Ravenna was sort of like sort of a touchstone, right, for the Byzantines. It was sort of a symbol, right, of this is where our empire ends and begins. This is where we're keeping an eye on things, right? But again, this was fairly far away from the capital of Constantinople, so keep that in mind. I had mentioned how Christian churches would be very plain on the exterior in the original days of church buildings, so you'll see that continued here with the very, very plain brick. You'll also notice it has a kind of weird shape and weird design. This is because it's using what we call a central plan rather than an axial plan. So we spoke about the axial plan over on the right. And this was adapted from the Roman basilical plan, which had been used for businesses and turned into a church plan. And we talked about how it was a straight line plan. You basically went in, went straight down through, and the altar would be in this area. Your eye would be focused right towards the end, right, of the apse area, right where the altar would be. The worshipers, of course, would be over in the aisles. The nave would be sacred space, right? Notice that the central plan does something completely different, right? It allows for the kind of this open-ended structure, which was not as straight line, right, in its design. And again, would be a little bit more confusing, a little bit more complex. Why they did this, we don't really know. Maybe just to be visually interesting. But again, you don't see a lot of centrally planned churches. You see, obviously, way more axially planned churches during this time period. Now, if you go inside, we can look at imagery. Here's the altar, by the way. So this is the apse imagery or the altar imagery above the altar in the apse area, that sort of curved area, right? That half circle area at the top. Here's a nice close up over here. This is a mosaic of Christ sitting on the world. I told you that they really love gold and they really love mosaics. Mosaics are made of cut stone. I'll show you a close up a little bit later of a technique, and so you can see how the technique works. But you'll notice that, again, lots of gold in this mosaic technique. Now, what's in the image? You have Christ in the center, surrounded by two angels, and then on one side, you have the bishop of the church, right? He's being handed actually a little model of the church. And then you have, of course, Saint Vitalis being handed his martyr's wreath, right? So you'll see Christ has the martyr's wreath. It's being handed over, right, to Saint Vitalis. Again, you don't really need to worry about the peripheral stuff. Christ is, to me, the most interesting thing here. Notice, first off, he's wearing a purple robe. We had talked about in Rome, purple was an imperial color. Go back and look at the Tetrarch's statue that was made out of porphyry. That color of the purple of the porphyry was symbolic, right? Here, a purple robe is signifying that this is Christ as ruler in a sense, right? He is, remember, I told you this idea of church and state is one thing, that Christ and the emperor, God and the emperor are kind of one thing. They're conflated together. So that wearing of the purple robe is very significant. And then you'll notice he's holding in his hand the Bible. In a sense, to me, it makes this the book of law. Again, God and religion and government are all sort of together, right? And so this is a powerful statement to me about that. If you look at the space, it's very not realistic. It's looking more stylized again. So we talked about how art will still keep kind of creeping back towards stylization all the way till we get to the medieval, and then it'll completely be stylized. It'll take the Renaissance to get realism back again. So you see that decline in style, right, still happening here as we look at this piece. The more famous of the mosaics are Justinian and his attendants, and of course his wife Theodora, that I'll show you here in a minute. These are placed as you are approaching the altar, so they're kind of to each side of the altar as you're moving down through the space. Notice a Justinian wearing purple again, right? So he's the emperor. And you'll notice he also has a halo. God as emperor, right? The conflation of those two things, the bringing together of those two things. On the left, you'll notice there are soldiers. On the right, the clergy or the people of the church. And so to me, he's making sort of an Augustus-like statement here. He's saying, like, I'm the Pontifex Maximus, I'm the Imperator, right? I am the church, I am the people, I am the princeps. He's everything. He bands these two groups together. No one is escaping his eye, right? He has his eye on everybody. If you look at the soldiers, right, they have a shield with what's called the Cairo on it. We'll talk more about the symbol of the Cairo. And to me, it says they're soldiers of God. Right, and then you have the clergy, of course, holding Bibles and crosses and incense censers and such. You'll notice that Justinian holds bread. This is meant to look like a loaf of bread because he is saying that he is part of the communion service, right? Or the idea of the bread and the wine, right? The blood and the body of Christ. And that's a pretty heady statement. But notice he's giving himself a halo. He's acting like the clergy. He's really making this statement about church and state and their connection to one another. If you look at the style of the piece, right, this is a mosaic, and you'll note again how stylized it is, right? They're all standing in kind of this very sort of, unrealistic way. Who stands with their feet all lapping over each other, right? That's not really how you do that unless you're posing. And then there's no bodies. They're all covered by these big, thick robes. And I think that's because they didn't know how to do contrapposto and stuff anymore. They were like, well, just throw a robe on it. Good to go, right? This is showing you the Cairo symbology, right? You can ignore the alpha and the omega over on the left, even though those are interesting. It's an interesting early Christian symbol of like the end and the beginning, that Christ is, the end and the beginning and all that. But the Cairo, you'll notice, is the Greek letters, two Greek letters meshed together, the chi and the rho. And basically, the Cairo is thought to symbolize the initials of Christ's name, right? So this idea of using the language, right, as a symbol. Kairos were used by early Christians to tell other Christians, like, here we are. It was something that the Romans at first didn't understand, similar to like using the fish that you see on people's cars today. That started in the early Christian time period because, again, it was a way to signal to other Christians, like, hey, we're fishers amongst men. Hey, or I'm a fisher. Are you a fisher? Kind of thing. The Cairo also functioned that way. So you'll see the Cairo used quite frequently in early Christian images. And again, on the shield, symbolizing this idea of Christ's soldiers, or, Justinian is using Christ's soldiers, right? So very interesting use of symbology. This is Theodora, Justinian's wife, the empress, who also had a very interesting backstory. Her family was entertainment. They're in the entertainment industry, probably like the same as like circus performers. I would say maybe they were like carnies, right? But entertainers at this time, if you were a female, also probably indicated that you were in another profession, if you get my drift, the world's oldest profession. So Theodora probably wasn't the patrician woman that Justinian thought people should marry. But he did, he fell in love with her, supposedly saw her at an event, fell in love with her, couldn't be talked out of it. But we think this image is meaning to try to cleanse her a bit. You'll notice the holy water fount as they're going into the building, and then the three wise men on the robe down here. So this idea of perhaps washing away her sins, cleaning her up, right? Making her empress worthy, right? Also notice that she's the woman, so she's still outside the church. Justinian's already gone inside, right? Her aides are about to take her in. So it shows her proper respect as far as gender roles at this time. And you'll notice she's carrying the wine, right? So he has the bread, she has the wine, and that's how they're functioning together. Now, I mentioned I'd show you mosaic and how mosaic worked. This is a good close-up of the Theodora piece. And you'll notice that mosaic is made by using cut stones, cut gems that are polished up. Sometimes they'd use stones and gold leaf them, like you see here. And each one had to be individually placed onto an adhesive surface, right? So they'd use a kind of glue on the surface, and then they'd press each piece in. Woo, it's time intensive. And you'll notice with mosaic, it's hard to get realism because you're using these chunky, blocked, shaded, it's a very specific kind of technique. So you'll notice in Byzantine pieces, there's a real lack of realism. There's a lot of stylization. And then there's sort of this hollow, I would say kind of emotionless look to the people. They just have this kind of no emotions on their face, no nothing. It's just very empty looking. And we think a lot of that's because of the style and the approach they were using to make a lot of these art pieces.